The French culture and language is a very important part of Canadian history and Canadian identity. This made me think about how every single Canadian Prime Minister from Confederation until today saw their French language and what their relation to it was. Let's start off with Sir John A. Macdonald. He was not fluent in French, but he did see the French language and culture as important in Canada. He understood the significance of French in Quebec and quite famously said, "Let us be English or let us be French, but most importantly, let us be Canadian." Even still, his buddy, George Etienne Cartier, spoke French anyways. Alexander Mackenzie. He was not fluent in French, and no evidence really suggests that Mackenzie cared about the rights of French speakers in Canada. His term was focused on nation building, however. No policies indicated a care for the French language or culture in Quebec. Sir John Abbott. He was the first prime minister from Quebec and the first to speak French as his first language. However, he was a strong advocate of English Quebec's business elites. Sir John Thompson. He was involved in the Manitoba schools question, which directly affected the rights of French Canadians. He also used French to court his wife, Annie Affleck. Sir Mackenzie Bowell. He had a limited and indirect relationship with the French language and was much more concerned with English speaking issues. Next up is Sir Charles Tupper. He spoke French and he read it frequently. He studied in French. However, his short term government prevented him from doing much for the French speakers. Sir Wilfrid Laurier. Laurier was the first Francophone prime minister, and he was a very strong advocate for cooperation between Anglo Canadians and Franco Canadians. He granted the right for non English speaking Manitobans to attend school and included a voluntary military service for people in the English speaking Canada because the Quebecois did not want to serve for the crown. Sir Robert Borden. As you know, he's not my favorite prime minister. But when he was in government, he faced backlash by the people for forcing the Quebecois into conscription for World War One. They didn't like this because they are dying for the British crown, and they're French. And if you know anything about French people, they don't like the British crown. Also, Ontario tried to end French speaking classes, and Borden refused to intervene, hurting his standing in Quebec. Not much to say for Arthur Meehan, but he did not reverse Borden's decision on the matter and disallowed French instruction entirely in Ontario. That's really it. William Lyon Mackenzie King. He could not speak French and relied on French Canadian politicians to support his government, portraying Ernest Lapointe as a co prime minister of some sort, and acknowledged the importance of French Canadian culture within Canada. R.B. Bennett. Bennett made the banknotes printed by the Bank of Canada bilingual, demonstrating a commitment to recognizing and valuing French identity within Canada. This led for the first time since 1911, a solid support for the Conservatives in Quebec. Louis Saint Laurent. He was the second Francophone prime minister. His father spoke French, and his mother was from Ireland. She spoke English. Louis Saint Laurent saw Francophones and Anglophones getting along peacefully every day in his half and half Quebec town of Compton, something that affected his views later on in life. John G. Diefenbaker. He spoke absolutely zero French and only had a limited knowledge on the French language and culture. He neglected French Canadian members of his caucus, hurting his support in Quebec. Next up is Lester B. Pearson. He played a pivotal role in advancing the rights of French Canadians by establishing the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism and advocating for official bilingualism. He believed that since Confederation in 1867, there had been a misunderstanding between English and French Canadians. He openly hoped to be the last bilingual prime minister, and while some prime ministers after him didn't speak great French, they did speak French. Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Trudeau was the third Francophone Prime Minister and officially made Canada bilingual early on in his premiership. He was obviously fluent in French, and he argued that being fluent in French would prove to be a big asset for a politician in bilingual Canada, which, yeah, it really is. Next up is Joe Clark. Clark spent some time in France to improve his French and took courses in French while living in France, and then eventually became fine with answering questions in French. John Turner. Turner hardly spoke French, and there's really nothing else to say. Brian Mulroney. Mulroney was born in northeast Quebec. His fluency in English and in French would eventually prove decisive. He decided to support French Manitoban rights, even when it could have costed him political points. Kim Campbell. She spoke French, and one of the two seats that her Progressive Conservative Party won in 1993 was actually a seat in Quebec. Jean Chrétien. Jean Chrétien was the fourth prime minister who was a francophone. He learned French as his first language, and he lived in Quebec his whole life. Paul Martin. Martin acknowledged the need for the French language and culture and spoke French. At an early age, he went to a French school in order to improve his French speaking skills. Now it's Stephen Harper. Honestly, Harper actually once rallied against bilingualism, but he then later on acknowledged knowing French was a surefire way to win in politics, although he didn't speak it very well. Penultimately, we've got Justin Trudeau. He was the fifth Francophone Prime Minister, lived in Quebec, and he spoke French as his first language. Although I do want to point out that he's the first Francophone Prime Minister to not speak English with a considerably heavy accent. Lastly, we've got Mark Carney. Mark Carney is not that great at speaking French. He cancelled a French debate in the 2025 election campaign. Despite this, Carney's Liberals gained a couple of seats off the Bloc Québécois in Quebec in the 2025 election. And there it is. Every single Canadian Prime Minister and their relation with the French language.